I will show you, plain and unflinching, what they did to her before the blade, how the machinery of revolution stripped a mother of everything it could until only a public spectacle remained. She was Marie Antoinette, once queen, by 1793 reduced to a woman whose maim was a political weapon. In the cramped hours between nights and days, beneath the damp stones of Paris, her story narrowed to two rooms, a boy who would not stop calling for his mother, and the faces of men who treated truth as malleable. Before we begin, stay with this to the end. If this account pulls at you, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is more like this, and we need your thinking on what history asks us to remember. If this piece moves you, like and tell us in the comments whether you see her as villain, victim, or something in between. By the summer of 1793, Marie Antoinette had already lost a crown and nearly everything that made life recognizably hers. The royal family's fall from Versailles to captivity had been measured in humiliations, forced separations, public caricatures, pamphlets that traded rumor for certainty. To many in the city, she was the enemy of the people. To the woman who had been Dauphine at 15 and a mother at 19, she was only a mother, increasingly unmoored by grief and the small claustrophobic arithmetic of prison. When she arrived at the temple, the stones smelled of stale straw and old oil. Every footstep in the corridors was a sentence. Guards moved with the courteous cruelty of men convinced of themselves. At night, candlelight threw spidery shadows across the shutters. She learned time not by the sun, but by the clink of keys in the dark. Conversation, once designed to charm ministers and foreign courts, shrank to questions about sleep, bread, and the welfare of her children. Her son, Louis Charles, was the center of every private world left to her. He was 8 years old, small, pale, with a child's capacity for both stubborn affection and sudden terror. In the beginning, he had clung to her in the corridor as if the world were something to hold on to. They allowed supervised visits, fragments of normality in an otherwise curated cruelty. Yet the state's gaze was not merely watchful. It intended to remold, to fracture the lineage by undermining the heart of it, the bond between mother and child. That bond, more than any political claim, was what the committee targeted. The seizure of Louis Charles unfolded not as a single cinematic moment, but as a series of calculated degradations. The boy was removed for supposed re-education. The man assigned to him, Antoine Simon, was characterized by the committee as a working-class tutor who would teach the child the virtues of the Republic. In practice, Simon and those who held power used the child as an instrument. They imposed habits, strange rituals, and accusations that would leave psychological marks rather than visible wounds. The effect was a slow, bureaucratic torture. The deliberate redirection of a child's loyalty away from his mother by small, humiliating measures that added up to profound loss. Inside the conciergerie, where Marie Antoinette was moved on August 1, the environment was more severe. A new cell meant less space, fewer comforts, and constant surveillance. The air there was colder. The light that came through the shutters was thin and indifferent. Guards spoke in clipped sentences. Notices were posted like verdicts. Her hair began to show the signs of stress. Hair that had once been powdered into fashionable shapes, thinned and fractured, sometimes whitening from strain. To those who watched with technical indifference, these were incidental facts. To those who loved her, they were visible signifiers of how an institution wore a person down. Isolation carried its own cruelty. Rules multiplied for the sake of order and, at the same time, for the sake of spectacle. Visitors were restricted. Letters were censored or intercepted. She composed, in the moments she could, letters that were acts of resistance, appeals to memory, to maternal rights, to basic humanity. One final letter, tender, precise, and intended for her daughter, would later be intercepted, a private testament turned into a fragment of state evidence. The interception of that letter was itself a weapon. Private sentiment made public, intimacy transformed into proof of guilt or frivolity. The tribunal where she would face judgment performed itself like theater. Fouquier-Tinville, who presided over the prosecutions, was less concerned with truth than with the management of public perception. He orchestrated hearings that had the cadence of an inquisition dressed as legality. Witnesses appeared, sometimes coached, sometimes weary, sometimes carrying the marks of coercion. The courtroom's light was theatrical, sharp, exposing. Journalists and onlookers filled the seats. The crowd outside moved like a second court, its moods turning swiftly from outrage to curiosity to a crueler appetite for spectacle. In the courtroom, the central moment that had been prepared months earlier finally arrived: the use of Louis Charles as evidence. The boy's testimony, extracted under the supervision of those who had custody of him, was presented not as the confused assertion of a child, but as a piece of decisive truth. The charge, among the gravest and most scandalous leveled against Marie Antoinette, relied on the testimony of a child who had been removed from his mother and placed under the authority of men whose interest was not to comfort, but to convert him into a tool. The tactic was chillingly simple: to break the image of a mother by suggesting monstrous intimacy, to convert private affection into political condemnation. The scene in court unfolded in abrupt beats. A judge's gavel, a clerk's dry voice reading accusations. The boy's small, faltering words mingled with the shuffle of feet and the impatient coughs of the gallery. Marie Antoinette, seated beneath the glare, listened with the practiced calm of someone whose life had been stripped to a few defendable truths. She could not, in that environment, remake laws or rewrite the city's fury. Instead, she found other means: dignity, clarity, a devotion to her children that was visible even when the world insisted otherwise. Reconstructed fragments of conversation, short, spare lines meant to capture the human exchange, help us imagine what was at stake. In the hushed space between the formal charges, she might have said, quietly, to a woman who leaned close, "Do not let them make of my son what they will." The words were small, the intent huge. Elsewhere, when the boy stumbled over facts supplied to him, her eyes betrayed the rawness of a mother watching her child be used as evidence. These moments are reconstructions, not verbatim transcripts, yet they fit the arc of what documents and contemporaneous reports allow us to infer: a concerted effort to weaponize family. Outside the courtroom, the crowd's reaction was not monolithic. Some in the mass jeered, eager for retribution. Others watched with a complicated gaze, curiosity mixed with a faint unease as the spectacle slid into cruelty. Revolution had promised a new moral order, and given, in practice, theatrical purges packaged as justice. The people who had once chanted for liberty now watched liberty being narrowed to a single, performative act: the public denunciation and humiliation of those who had stood at the apex of the old order. The prosecution piled up details, real, alleged, and muddled, until the portrait it presented was of a woman who had misused power in the privacy of palaces. But the method of proving that portrait relied less on verifiable acts than on the orchestration of humiliation. Private letters cited out of context, witnesses whose testimonies changed with pressure, and the testimony of an 8-year-old whose daily life had been engineered by others. This was not only legal strategy, it was psychological warfare dressed as civic procedure. Physically, she did not wither in a single dramatic motion. The decline showed itself in the small humiliations, the ritual of daily inspection, the cheapness of food served under guard, the indignity of sanctioned visits that turned affection into evidence. She found small resistances where she could: a smuggled flower, a note passed under a door. These were acts of defiance against a regime that equated control with truth. In the confined world of the conciergerie, meaning accumulated in gestures and memories. She remembered the long, luminous days at Versailles, the music, the children's laughter, memories which in prison were not mere past, but lifelines. As October came, the pace accelerated. The trial took place in the harsh light of mid-October. Dates on the calendar, October 14 to 16, became the frame for the decisive public act. The prosecution wound its case with a grim efficiency. On the bench, those who had the power to decide were shaped by the need to appear decisive, to render final judgment for a nation reinventing itself by erasing its past. Functions that had once been shrouded in ceremony were now reduced to swift motions: reading, condemning, transporting. In the final days before her sentence, she wrote a letter that later came to be read as a private testament. It was composed with a mother's meticulous tenderness, small reminders, requests for the care of her children, prayers that the world would one day see them spared further harm. That letter, because it was intercepted and parceled into evidence, became another instrument of the public process. Intimacy exposed, vulnerability turned into a spectacle of supposed guilt. The members of the tribunal treated every private text as possible proof. The invasion of privacy was not accidental, but intentional, a tactic to convert human feeling into incriminating material. On the morning she was taken to the place of execution, the contrast could not have been more cruel. Prison darkness gave way to a sunlight so bright it seemed almost obscene. The same light that reveals also humiliates. She was placed upon a cart, the tumbril, that reduced her to commodity. People lined the route, some silent in awe, others shouting, others indifferent. The cart moved slowly, an animalized procession that dragged a woman from the confined geometry of her cell into the vastness of the public eye. In a final, striking gesture, one that humanized her in a way no pamphlet ever had, she apologized to the executioner. The apology was not for crimes she had committed. It was for tarnishing the moment of his duty with the burden of her person. She removed her outer garments so the executioner would not struggle with fabric. She fixed the collar of her dress with a small, private grace. Those gestures were not theatrics. They were the last coherent acts of a woman who, until the end, retained agency in how she presented herself to the world. When the blade fell, the Republic recorded a legal victory. But history would later record a tension that did not yield to the guillotine's finality. The question of justice versus theater, prosecution versus pity, and the way institutions can strip humanity piece by deliberate piece. The symbols linger: the red cap, the tumbril, the guillotine's cold geometry, icons not just of retribution, but of a system that made spectacle of suffering. To look back at Marie Antoinette is to confront a complicated legacy. She was not a saint. She had been part of a world that preserved privilege and made choices that mattered. But to reduce her to caricature alone is to miss how the state weaponized motherhood, privacy, and a child's testimony to secure a political narrative. What they did to her before the blade, coercing, isolating, intercepting the most intimate artifacts of her life, was less an accident of war and more a deliberate policy of erasure. There are echoes that follow: the intercepted letters, the transformed testimony, the public performance of law. These are methods that do not vanish with a single execution. They teach us, if we are willing to learn, about the ways institutions can manufacture consent and the fragility of private life under public scrutiny. And they force a question: when a society strips a person of every small dignity, can the act ever be justified as justice? She left behind the image of a mother, a woman, a symbol retooled by many hands. In the quiet that followed, those who remembered her privately kept other memories: the way she touched her son's sleeve, the steady neatness of her letters, the small acts of kindness smuggled into prison life. These are the counterweights to the public record. What follows in this account will trace the trial more closely, lay bare the ways testimony was shaped, and bring you to that final carriage, step by step. It is a story of institutional cruelty measured in minutes and in the slow attrition of dignity. It is also a story of a human being who, within those constraints, kept a measure of herself intact. The trial itself opened not as inquiry, but as a public performance rehearsed into certainty. On the appointed morning, the hall filled with those whose presence gave weight to verdict: deputies in plain coats, officials who kept the machinery of the revolution moving, scribes to render each phrase into a permanent record. The judges sat high and composed, their robes a secular liturgy. At the center, enclosed by a low railing, was the defendant, not in a throne room, but in a cage of wood and iron that made of justice an instrument of display. The public prosecutor approached the bench with the practiced gravity of one who understood the charge and cadence could stand for proof. He recited the list of accusations in a voice even and inexorable: crimes against the people, collusion with foreign enemies, the squandering of the nation's resources, the corrupting of morals. Each item was a knotted rope that bound past rumor to present condemnation. It was not enough to allege. The prosecutor needed witnesses, documents, and the spectacle of cross-examination to transmute suspicion into legal fact. Evidence arrived in the shape of papers, receipts, letters, memoranda, taken from trunks and secret drawers, placed on the table as if their very presence declared guilt. Those documents were read aloud, line by line, their sentences extracted and arranged so that context thinned and implication thickened. A tender remark about a dress became indulgence. An administrative note about household spending became proof of prodigality. A private letter where a mother summoned recipes or soothed a child's fever was parsed into testimony of either vanity or conspiracy, depending on how the reader preferred to see it. Witnesses were shepherded into that same logic. Some came willingly, men and women who had been patient collaborators in the new order, eager for the favor of a tribunal whose praise could secure place and safety. Others came under pressure, summoned in the night, their recollections smoothed by careful questioning, their answers shaped by the fear of being seen as sympathetic. There were servants who, having known the intimacy of a household, spoke of routines and habits. Their words were clipped into evidence of extravagance. There were functionaries whose pages of ledger entries were translated into a narrative of theft. A neighbor's casual remark, whispered years before in a salon, could be recast as confession when read between the lines of an accuser's brief. At times, testimony itself arrived as a performance arranged by those in authority. The questions asked were not neutral probes, but ladders placed so witnesses could climb into the conclusions desired by the court. An uncertain recollection became certain when the prosecutor insisted upon it. Silence was intolerable, hesitation an opening for corrective suggestion. In the faces of those testifying, one could read a forced composure, the mechanical repetition of a story that had been practiced until it fit the pattern the judges had in mind. Defense, to whatever measure allowed by the tribunal, was a different economy. Counsel could speak, but only within the frame the court permitted. Requests for time to gather witnesses, for an adjournment in light of newly produced documents, were met with curt refusals. When defense attempted to reinsert context, to show that a figure of speech had been misconstrued, that expenditure had been wartime exigency rather than luxury, that a private letter had been folded into evidence by someone who stood to gain from its circulation, the answers were not always heard. The momentum of accusation ran on the rails of public expectation. To halt it for nuance risked being read as sheltering the accused. There were singular moments that revealed the tribunal's appetite for theatrical closure. A list of names, correspondents, courtiers, intermediaries, was read as if each entry were a condemned deed. The mere presence of a foreign signature invited implication of conspiracy. A sealed packet of correspondence opened in the court emitted to the room the same intimacy that once lived in a bedroom or a desk. Its private phrases, now public, were transfigured into instruments of state narrative. At other moments, the prosecutor paused, lifting a small object or a scrap of paper for all to see, and the spectators leaned forward as if a talisman had been presented that would finally justify their collective rage. None of this happened in a vacuum. Outside the hall, the press and the pamphleteers had already done their work. Libels and caricatures, printed and pasted in the streets, had framed the imagination of many who filed into the tribunal. The court's act was not merely to adjudicate, but to confirm a story that the public had been told. That a life once gilded had been converted into a danger to the nation. To contradict that story in open court required not only proof, but the dismantling of a myth that the revolution had found useful to its own cohesion. And so the verdict, when it fell, seemed less a sudden thunderbolt than the end of a long, orchestrated refrain. The judges read the sentence in formal language. The words themselves were meant to be a seal. The convicted woman received notice with a restraint that baffled some observers and touched others. She did not weep for the loss of title or rank. She tended to the practicalities of the moment, arranging the care of children, making small petitions, correcting the folding of a sleeve. Those gestures, calculated by some, dignified by others, became in themselves a kind of testimony. To the court, they were not private acts of a human being, but further evidence, an unwilling complicity with the role history had assigned her. In the hours between judgment and execution, the mechanisms of state continued their quiet work. Prison officers prepared lists, clerks transcribed the sentence for public posting, messengers ran to arrange the city's watch. The condemned was returned to the cell that had been both refuge and cage. Friends attempted to visit, to pass short comforts. Some were turned away. The letter she wrote, the intimate testament of motherly detail that later surfaced as a public dossier, was created in this narrow time. It was written slowly, with the care of someone who knows that paper will be the last medium left to speak. Its sentences included little domestic demands and small remembrances. Its tone was the tone of a life that had once been entire enough to hold such things. That letter, when intercepted, would do the work of a new kind of evidence. Tenderness redefined as manipulation. Affection read as calculation. The city, meanwhile, prepared for display. Those who would gather to witness the transport to the place of execution did not arrive by accident. Posters called for attendance. Committees ensured order. The routes were policed not simply to prevent disorder, but to curate the sight lines through which the crowd would view the punishment. The state was aware that spectacle functioned as pedagogy. To punish before many eyes was to teach. When at last the hour came to lift the prison door and put the guilty upon the cart, there was a ritual to even the smallest gesture. The women who accompanied the condemned were chosen, the manner of dress prescribed, not for comfort but for the optics of the moment. The guards who held the ropes were briefed into cadence of their steps. The tumbril itself, with its rough wood, bore not only a passenger but the weight of political example. For those who watched, a hand lifted to a hat was not only a salute, but a statement of allegiance. For those who followed in silence, the procession was an unavoidable lesson in the reach of revolutionary law. And yet, within that choreography, there were fissures of human response that refused easy translation into propaganda. Some in the crowd could not look. Others spoke low prayers. A few made gestures of compassion that would be remembered privately. The condemned noticed these things, and in a modest, deliberate manner she answered them. She apologized to the executioner. She adjusted her collar so that the final action would not be marred by awkwardness. These acts were not performance for the tribunal, but the last sovereign choices of a person insisting on the dignity of small courtesy. What the tribunal had aimed to accomplish in public, the conversion of human complexity into a legible crime, had yielded a kind of paradox. The spectacle of law had not entirely consumed the life it sought to annihilate. Instead, it had revealed both the capacity of institutions for cruelty and the stubborn persistence of small human sovereignties that would not be taken even when titles and freedoms were stripped. The trial had been a machine engineered to produce a narrative. The execution followed that narrative to its mechanical end. But memory, as always, is less obedient. In the months and years that followed, private recollections, letters hidden away, and the quiet testimony of those who had known kindness would become the other archive, a counter-history that insisted upon the person behind the public figure. The court's record remained. The pamphlets multiplied. The city's squares broadcast the verdict as lesson and closure. Still, the story would not settle entirely into the shape the state preferred. Time, stubborn and unpredictable, would carry off the immediate triumphs of spectacle and leave behind questions about the means used to attain them. The interception of letters, the shaping of witness, the conversion of intimacy into evidence. These methods, the trial had shown, were not incidental to triumph, but intrinsic to it. What the tribunal had adjudicated in law, it had also enacted in form, and that form, once witnessed, could not be simply unlearned. The procession ended where it had been meant to end. The mechanism performed its appointed function. And yet, even as the legal apparatus sealed its verdict, the private gestures, the intercepted letter, and the quiet acts of care that had been recorded in other hands continued to travel beyond the court, beyond the cart, into the long reckoning that would follow. This is the place where history often bifurcates, one archive kept in official ink, the other held in memory and in the small artifacts that survive because for a moment someone refused to let them be burned. From the hall of the tribunal to the square and beyond, the machinery had shown how a state could make of law a theater and of evidence an instrument of theater. But what it could not entirely consume was the stubborn fact of human interiority, the ways affection, routine, and a mother's small attentions resist reduction to political charge. Those residual things, a neatly folded sleeve, a recipe, a whispered prayer, passed into other hands and other retellings, where they would complicate the tidy moral the tribunal had been so eager to proclaim. The story, therefore, did not close with a single blade. It continued in letters, in whispers, and in the slow work of remembrance that refused to be convened by any judge.